Good evening. I'm Amy Ng, Associate Curator at the Frick Collection. Welcome to the Frick. 1 month ago, the exhibition Andrea del Sarto, the Renaissance Workshop in Action, opened here at the Frick, a collaboration with the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, where it was on view over the summer. It's the first major exhibition devoted to the art of Andrea del Sarto ever held in the United States. The show brings together from international collections Andrea's drawings and paintings, in many cases reuniting works that were last together in the artist's studio in Florence 500 years ago. Like most of our exhibitions, the Andrea del Sarto show brings to the museum not only breathtaking works of art, but also a wealth of scholars. This season's lecture program is rich. Last month, the opening lecture was given by Julian Brooks, curator of drawings at the Getty Museum, and really the driving force behind the exhibition. In a couple of weeks, Nicholas Penny, former director of the National Gallery, will speak about Andrea del Sarto and sculpture. And in early December, Linda Woke-Simon, Director and Chief Curator of the University Museums at Fairfield University, Connecticut, will tackle the topic of Andrea del Sarto and Raphael. All of this information can be found on our website. What is particularly special about tonight's lecture is that our speaker brings home, in a sense, the world of Andrea del Sarto to the Frick's own permanent collection. Andrea del Sarto and his workshop are an essential part of the story of Renaissance Florence. He died in 1530, just at the fall of the last Republic of Florence. The Medici family returned to power, and the city of Florence started a new chapter. As many of you know, one of the Frick's great Italian paintings, Bronzino's portrait of Lodovico Capponi, that impeccably handsome young man posing against that brilliant green background, emerges from this chapter in Florentine history. I'm honored to introduce tonight's speaker, a specialist in the Florentine Renaissance, and in particular in the art of Agnolo Bronzino. Dr. Julia Siemon is currently Research Associate at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, where she's curating an important exhibition opening in the fall of 2017. The focus of her exhibition are the Aldobrandini tazze, a set of exquisite late 16th century masterpieces of goldsmiths' work that complement, indeed embody, the refinement and erudition of Dr. Siemon's own scholarship. She's also a lecturer in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, where she earned her PhD just earlier this year. Her lecture tonight draws directly from her dissertation entitled Bronzino, Politics and Portraiture in 1530s Florence. And Julia knows intimately the city of Florence, not just because she has twice run the Florence Marathon. Her extensive research there was supported by fellowships at the Kunsthistorisches Institute and the Medici Archive Project. It's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight. It's not a great pleasure, but I have to do it. That is to ask you to check that your mobile devices are turned off or to silent. And I'll give you a second in case you want to double check. Tonight's event is made possible by the Robert H. Smith Family Fund, which has so generously supported our programs for many years. After the lecture, please join us in 2 galleries that will remain open for viewing until 7:30. The Oval Room, in which part of the Andrea del Sarto exhibition is installed, and the South Hall, where you'll be able to say hello to Bronzino. Dr. Siemon's lecture is entitled Bronzino Before the Medici. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Hi. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Xavier Solomon for so generously inviting me here this evening, and to Amy, who I can't see anymore, for welcoming me and for all of her help with getting set. Okay. Among the many works gathered for this tremendous exhibition is a tender red chalk study of the Madonna and Child with St. John, a drawing carried out by Andrea del Sarto in the second decade of the 16th century. In the galleries downstairs, only one side of the paper is currently visible. But were you able to flip the sheet, revealing its reverse, you would find that the artist has drawn on the other side as well. Appearing on the back, here unfortunately reproduced in black and white, are two disembodied arms, one holding a broad-brimmed hat, while the other, sharply foreshortened, extends outward towards the viewer. These gestures belong to a figure in Andrea's painting of Joseph interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh, completed for the Florentine banker Pierfrancesco Borgherini. On the occasion of Borgherini's wedding in 1515, Andrea was commissioned, together with 3 other artists, to carry out a number of scenes from the story of Joseph, panels that were to decorate Borgherini's marriage bedchamber. These paintings were a gift to Borgherini and his new wife from Borgherini's father, and the subject was chosen for its emphasis on the relationship between fathers and sons. It seems fitting, therefore, that in the works designed for this space, we can trace a kind of genealogy of some of the most important Florentine painters of the early and mid-16th century. For example, collaborating on the series with Andrea was his former student, Jacopo Pontormo, who was by then in his early 20s and already an accomplished painter in his own right. Moreover, in the foreground of one of Pontormo's contributions to the bedchamber, a panel showing Joseph and Jacob in Egypt, the artist has in turn included a charming likeness of his favorite young apprentice. Sitting on the stairs, clutching his basket, is a boy who would grow to become one of the foremost Florentine painters of his age. He is the little Agnolo Bronzino, whose early portraits are the subject of this evening's lecture. Bronzino, of course, is well known to this audience as the author of the captivating portrait of Ludovico Capponi, on view here in the Frick's South Hall. The portrait dates to the 1550s, nearly 40 years after the artist made his youthful appearance in Pontormo's Joseph picture. In the Frick portrait, Ludovico, posed against a vibrant green curtain, holds a cameo inscribed with the word sorte, or fate, the letters partially obscured by one elongated finger. This elegant young man was a page at the Florentine court of Duke Cosimo I de' Medici, and his enigmatic portrait has often been discussed in the context of Ludovico's relationship with that duke. In fact, some sort of Medician context can be found in discussions of nearly all of Bronzino's paintings, for the artist's modern reputation centers on his role as court painter to Duke Cosimo and his wife, Eleonora di Toledo. Bronzino is undoubtedly most famous as court painter to the Medici. Many of his best-known works are portraits of the ducal family or paintings commissioned by its members. This point is underscored by the title of the only monographic exhibition ever dedicated to Bronzino's paintings, which was held in Florence in 2010. The show's title defines the painter in clear terms as artist and poet at the court of the Medici. Yet Bronzino, in fact, completed a number of paintings before the start of his association with Duke Cosimo's court, and certain of these works can be shown to respond to an entirely different political atmosphere. Bronzino's relationship with Cosimo and Eleonora began only in 1539 on the occasion of their marriage. According to the biographer Giorgio Vasari, Bronzino first caught the attention of his most celebrated patrons through the production of decorative ephemera for the event. Born in 1503, the painter was thus already 36 years old at the start of his relationship with the Medici court. Before that time, Bronzino completed a number of elegant portraits of the city's young men. Where they can be identified, the sitters are connected to each other and to Bronzino by their involvement in Florentine academic communities, while the images themselves are visually linked by elements of presentation, style, cultural reference, and intellectual tone. Finely but soberly dressed, the subjects appear in compositions designed to accentuate their Florentine identity. These portraits are filled with references to the most important artists and writers in the Tuscan tradition, including Donatello, Michelangelo, Petrarch, and Dante. For example, in Bronzino's portrait of Ugolino Martelli, the figure's pose is inspired by Michelangelo's Giuliano dei Medici, a sculpture whose influence is equally evident in the unidentified lyric poet at the Uffizi. An allegorical portrait of Dante, carried out in the early 1530s and clearly related to this group, is likewise indebted to Michelangelo's statue. Meanwhile, the Ugolino Martelli, the Bartolomeo Panciatichi, and the Metropolitan Young Man with a Book all stand within similarly rendered and unmistakably Florentine architectural spaces. Finally, all 6 portraits are characterized by a quiet literary emphasis, with the Lorenzo Lenzi, the Dante, and the Ugolino Martelli even incorporating legible selections of text. Only the lyric poet, in which an inkwell appears, does not include a book. These images' emphasis upon Florence's artistic and literary patrimony has been interpreted as a display of dispassionate political complacency, expedient in the 1530s, a period of social unrest. This approach, however, neglects the decade's history of active political dissent. Reconsideration of the portraits of Ugolino Martelli and Dante suggests that, at least in these 2 paintings, Bronzino and his patrons employ famous works of art and literature not in order to disengage from current events, but rather to dissimulate, that is, to camouflage their political content. These 2 portraits draw parallels with the past as a means to safely communicate Republican sentiment in the Medici-dominated present. The rise of the Medici to political dominance over Florence began 100 years earlier, in 1434, with the return of the family from exile and the elevation of Cosimo the Elder to the position of Gran Maestro, or unofficial head of state. Cosimo's personal ascent coincided with that of his family, as the Medici gained increasing influence over the delicately balanced oligarchy. Through manipulation and financial leverage, they exerted disproportionate control over the ostensibly Republican government. This authority survived multiple failed uprisings and was maintained and augmented in the latter half of the century by Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lorenzo's rule remains famous as the Renaissance moment par excellence, in which he presided over an elite collection of intellectuals, musicians, poets, philosophers, and artists in his Platonic academy. But Lorenzo's death in 1492 was followed by 2 years of turmoil under his incompetent son, Piero. In 1494, the unpopular Piero was ousted and the Medici expelled from Florence. The end of the 15th century saw the city cowed by the religious extremism of Girolamo Savonarola, but the Florentines soon wavered in their support for the priest's brand of intolerant austerity. Savonarola's control ended in the spectacle of his execution in front of the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of the Republican government. A new constitution was then adopted in 1501, and in 1502, Piero Soderini was elected as gonfaloniere, or leader of the Republic. The following year, in 1503, Agnolo Bronzino was born, and much of his early childhood was spent in a Republican Florence. Yet although Soderini had been elected gonfaloniere for life, he in fact held the position for only 10 years. His government was dismantled in 1512 when Giovanni de' Medici, first as cardinal, then as Pope Leo X, helped his family regain dominance over the city. This time, the Medici would retain control of Florence for 15 years, fending off a number of Republican attempts to restore the Republic. Finally, however, in 1527, the Republicans successfully took advantage of the disarray following the sack of Rome and once again expelled the Medici from Florence. The city was converted into a republic with Christ declared its one true sovereign. 14 months later, in October of 1529, the siege of Florence began. For 10 brutal months, foreign armies, allied in support of the Medician cause, battered and starved the city. On the 12th of August, 1530, the Republicans surrendered. Representatives of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V and his Medici allies assumed control of the city, making way for the establishment of the Medici Duchy. We now recognize the finality of this change. Florence would never again be a republic. Still, when addressing apparent political sentiment in works of art produced in the 1530s, the past changeability in Florentine power should be recalled. The city's frequent shifts in government helps explain the resilience of anti-Medician sentiment in the decade beginning with the siege, and likewise helps account for the presence of Republican imagery in works created long after the last Republic's fall. Florence in the 1530s was a city characterized by violence and economic depression. Unlike the overthrow of the Soderini Republic in 1512, the Medici Restoration of 1530 was brutal and prolonged, leaving the city with what the historian Paolo Simoncelli has termed a deep ideological wound. The aftermath of the siege also reduced the city's population by at least a third, in part because of the hasty flight of many Republicans wary of retaliation from their victorious enemies. And they had good reason to fear the change in government had serious repercussions for opponents of the new regime. Between August and December of 1530, 8 were executed, several tortured, and some 300 imprisoned. Nearly 200 Republicans were immediately banished, while countless more departed of their own accord. Among those who chose to leave was the painter Agnolo Bronzino. In 1530, Bronzino abandoned Florence for Pesaro, seeking the patronage of Duke Guidobaldo della Rovere, whose portrait he painted during his stay. Though we have no statement to the fact, it seems that the recent shift in government was not to the painter's taste. Vasari connects Bronzino's departure from Florence not with the distress of the siege, but with its conclusion and result. Pesaro served as a popular refuge for displaced anti-Medicians, but whatever Bronzino's personal politics, his departure comes as no surprise. After the peace of 1530, very few of the city's artists remained. The siege and its aftermath had scattered or killed many of them, while draining their patrons of their resources. Franciabigio, Domenico Puligo, and Andrea del Sarto were dead. Rosso Fiorentino left Florence for the French court of Francis I, while Francesco Salviati and Jacopino del Conte each departed for Rome. Yet despite having left the city in 1530, Bronzino returned to Florence 2 years later at the behest of his teacher and friend, Pontormo. One of the very first commissions he undertook upon his arrival was the allegorical portrait of Dante. This painting was part of a large collaborative program intended for a bedroom, not unlike the Borgherini bedchamber decorations in which Bronzino made his youthful cameo some 20 years previous. In this case, Bronzino worked together with Pontormo and Michelangelo. Vasari, in his Life of Pontormo, gives a history of the commission. He explains that the Florentine banker Bartolomeo Bettini had asked his dear friend Michelangelo to prepare a cartoon, that is, the design for an image of Venus being kissed by Cupid, which could then be completed by Pontormo. The resulting work is today housed at the Accademia in Florence, and its strange symbolism has yet to be completely deciphered. This picture, Vasari continues, was intended by Bettini to go in his bedroom, for which Bronzino was commissioned to provide 3 more paintings, works which would be set in lunettes along the walls. These would be portraits of Boccaccio, Dante, and Petrarch, authors who had sung of love in Tuscan verse and prose. Bronzino's Dante appears in a landscape of his own design. He sits upon a small outcropping of green-tinted earth, turning away from the flames of hell to gaze across the waters of the southern hemisphere towards Mount Purgatory. This seems to be the first of Bronzino's portraits in which the painter has turned to Michelangelo's marble Giuliano dei Medici for the figure's inspiration. This allusion to the famous sculpture lends Dante a weighty physicality and emphasizes his Florentine identity. The importance of Dante's relationship with his native city is underscored at left, where the poet's right hand pulls our attention to a tiny Florentine skyline, actually just the cathedral's dome and bell tower, which peeks out from a valley in the shadowy terrestrial plain. There, dark of night has settled, while, at the opposite ends of the earth, the sun shines on Purgatory. Seated at the center of the image, Dante seems both commanding and rather melancholy as he offers up a substantial copy of his Divine Comedy for us to read. In several ways, Bronzino's allegorical portrait of Dante recalls earlier Florentine representations of the poet. In the 15th century, civic pride inspired public commissions for Dante's likeness to be installed both at the Cathedral of Florence and at the seat of government, the Palazzo della Signoria. In 1465, for the cathedral, Domenico di Michelino painted an image of Dante standing outside the relatively diminutive walls of Florence. With Mount Purgatory rising behind, the poet gestures towards the pits of hell and holds open a copy of his book. Though Domenico's Dante lacks the broad muscularity of Bronzino's poet, the men wear the same traditional dress and laurel crown, and both present the viewer with legible copies of the Divine Comedy. So too does an Intarsia Dante by Giuliano da Maiano, which appears on a door in the Palazzo della Signoria and which was carried out in 1481 after a design by Botticelli. Comparison with the physiognomy of Bronzino's poet, as shown in this preparatory drawing now in Munich, makes it abundantly clear that Bronzino, in his allegorical portrait of Dante, held close to established Florentine modes of portraying the author. Yet in one significant way, Bronzino's portrait of Dante breaks with tradition. In the 15th century portraits in the cathedral and at the Palazzo della Signoria, the poet presents the opening passage of the Inferno. These are the very famous lines of the very famous opening lines of the entire Divine Comedy, beginning with Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. Bronzino's portrait of Dante, however, contains an entirely different selection of text. More than 20 years ago, Jonathan Nelson drew attention to the fact that, whereas all previous instances of legible text in portraits of Dante reproduce the opening stanzas of the Divine Comedy, Bronzino's version instead includes the first lines from Canto 25 of Paradiso, lines in which the poet laments his expulsion from Florence. Although this section of Bronzino's painting is in poor condition, the words are still quite legible. In the passage here reproduced, Dante turns a critical eye upon his distant city. He chides those wolves who have cast him out of Florence, the sheepfold where he was once a lamb. Writing in exile, Dante longs for his return. He begins, "If it should happen, if this sacred poem, this work so shared by heaven and earth that it has made me lean throughout these long years, can ever overcome the cruelty that bars me from the fair fold where I slept, a lamb opposed to wolves that wore upon it, by then with other voice, with other fleece, I shall return as poet and put on at my baptismal font the laurel crown." In presenting these lines, rather than the opening of the Divine Comedy, Bronzino's portrait marks a significant break with tradition. Upon discovering the deviation, Nelson proposed that Bronzino's painting should be understood in ideological terms. And given the tenor of the text, he interpreted the portrait as a critique of the contemporary political situation in Florence. Such an interpretation fits well with the circumstances of the portrait's patron. Bettini was an outspoken Republican who not only had family members in exile, but who would himself flee to Rome shortly after Bronzino's Dante was complete. Yet even setting aside any personal significance for Bettini, the Florentine political situation at the time of the portrait's painting was such that this particular passage from Dante must have felt especially relevant. In 1532, the same year that Bronzino returned to Florence, Alessandro de' Medici was made the city's first duke, a role for which he was poorly suited. Following his elevation, the city became, in the words of Bronzino's friend Benedetto Varchi, a place filled with, quote, melancholy and discontent, its people all incredibly sad and filled with regret. Tales quickly spread of Alessandro's brutal disposition and wanton, if not predatory, sexual tastes. Angry Florentines, including those who had supported the Republican surrender of 1530, widely decried his rule as tyrannical. In response, the ranks of Florentine exiles swelled, establishing large Florentine communities primarily based in Rome, Lyon, and the Veneto. From abroad, these so-called fuoriusciti instituted a formal republic of exiles, with elections held in 1532 and 34 to select 6 representatives, calling them the advocates for the liberty of the Florentine Republic. Thus, in spite of the Medici victory in 1530, in the years that followed, the Florentine Republic maintained an active, although uprooted, existence based on popular representation. Given the obvious topical relationship between the content of Dante's text and the political situation in the early and mid-1530s, Nelson's proposal that the allegorical portrait of Dante should be understood in political terms has been uniformly accepted. Yet Bronzino's Dante is perhaps even more directly polemical than has been previously noted. Among the Florentine exiles cast out by the change in government was a Republican politician and letterato named Donato Gianotti. In 1530, Gianotti was arrested and tortured, barely escaping with his life, before being sentenced to 6 years' banishment from his native Florence. This forced removal had an unexpected literary effect, transforming Gianotti's views on Dante. In the years immediately following the Republican defeat of 1530, Gianotti composed a partisan treatise outlining his ideal Florentine government, his De la Repubblica. In one chapter of the treatise, Gianotti examines Dante's repeated vilification of the Florentines, condemnation that had previously puzzled the author. He writes, "I used to wonder at the poet Dante, who, throughout his works, refers to the Florentine people as wolves. Though he had once thought it strange that, quote, a man of such great learning and prudence should thus slander the city, recent events had changed Gianotti's mind. But now," he writes, "I perfectly understand that they deserve it. Dante did not err." In demonstrating the contemporary applicability of Dante's polemics, Gianotti focuses his argument on the very same passage from the 25th canto of Paradiso, which features so prominently in Bronzino's allegorical portrait of Dante. Gianotti's work on his De la Repubblica and Bronzino's allegorical portrait of Dante are contemporary, both roughly datable to circa 1532 or 4. And both are characterized by a very similar blend of patriotic nostalgia and political censure, presented here in literary terms. As in Gianotti's Republican treatise, Bronzino's painting uses Dante's celebrated legacy in order to construct a bitter comment upon the fate of the Florentine poet in the early years following the siege. Whether or not Bronzino and Gianotti knew of each other's use of the passage is as yet unclear. Nevertheless, there is good reason to consider whether the portrait's composition may have been influenced by Gianotti's thinking. His De la Repubblica was quite well known despite remaining unpublished, necessary because such an endeavor would have jeopardized the life of anyone involved. More importantly, there is a specific link connecting Gianotti to Bronzino's portrait of Dante, in the form of the artist's collaborator in the Bettini bedroom, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo and Gianotti became friends when they worked together for the government of the last republic in the late 1520s. After its defeat, they exchanged letters and sonnets and spent time together in Rome. Moreover, Gianotti was involved at least once in brokering an artistic commission for Michelangelo. It was Gianotti who arranged for Michelangelo to carve his celebratory bust of Brutus for the influential anti-Medician Cardinal Niccolò Ridolfi. And much like Bronzino's allegorical portrait of Dante, Michelangelo's Brutus uses the subject's historical pedigree as a means to comment on present political realities. The work was carried out after the assassination of Duke Alessandro de' Medici in 1537, an event to which we will shortly return. Finally, there is also evidence that Gianotti and Michelangelo were accustomed to exchanging views on Dante. In the 1540s, when Gianotti and Michelangelo were together in Rome, Gianotti wrote a treatise on the Divine Comedy presented in the form of a fictional dialogue. One of his interlocutors in the conversation is in fact Michelangelo, and this dialogue is understood by their biographers to be the result of a real and regular exchange of ideas between the two men. Returning to the Bettini bedroom, it has been proposed that Michelangelo was responsible not only for the design of Pontormo's Venus and Cupid, but also for the entire iconographic program, which would, of course, include Bronzino's Dante. In any case, given Michelangelo's involvement, it seems unlikely that the appearance of the very same lines from the 25th canto of Paradiso in both Bronzino's picture and Gianotti's political treatise could be the result of a simple coincidence. It is abundantly clear that in both the De la Repubblica and the allegorical portrait of Dante, the text was chosen for its particular ability to express partisan response to recent events. Legible text functions analogously in Bronzino's portrait of Ugolino Martelli. Here, even more so than in the Dante, written words communicate the patron's sentiment, but only to an erudite viewer who could understand their significance. After all, in the 1530s, registering political opposition could be a dangerous act, a fact Ugolino would come to know all too well. In 1558, more than 20 years after being portrayed by Bronzino, Ugolino would be the subject of a spiteful letter sent by a Florentine courtier to Duke Cosimo I de' Medici. The author was one of Ugolino's former friends, a well-known academician named Luca Martini. Nevertheless, in his letter to the Duke, Martini writes that Ugolino, quote, deserves to be punished and chastised. The censure is political. Martini urges Duke Cosimo to reject any attempt by Ugolino to lessen the constraints of his, Ugolino's, exile. The letter cites, along with Ugolino's tanti difetti, his many personal defects, Ugolino's long service to the most persistent enemies of the Duke. The target of this criticism appears at the age of about 18 in Bronzino's portrait today at the Gemälde Gallery in Berlin. Likely painted in the autumn of 1537, the portrait predates the young man's exile and notoriety, and interpretations of the image's dense symbolic material have not taken into account his anti-Medician loyalties. Nevertheless, in Bronzino's portrait, Ugolino demonstrates precisely those political sympathies that will later incur so much criticism from the ducal government and its allies. Portrayed in 3/4 length, Ugolino appears lightly perched on a simple wooden bench in the immediate foreground of the image. At his right, a red table, partially draped in green, emerges from beyond the frame. With one hand, Ugolino props a book upright on his thigh, while 2 more volumes rest upon the table. One of these lies open, oriented outward towards the viewer. Dropping a finger lightly down upon the text, Ugolino guides us to a particular phrase in the 9th book of Homer's Iliad. While gesturing to Bronzino's neatly copied Greek, Ugolino turns to look pointedly over his shoulder, his eyes directing us towards a statue of David with the head of Goliath, a real object in the family's collection, standing high on a pedestal in the background. The courtyard is otherwise empty. The expansive background area, although structured with precise perspectival geometry and treated with a uniform source of light, is far from convincing in the creation of believable illusionistic space. Strong vertical features and sharply cutting orthogonals collapse the image from 3 dimensions into 2. Distant elements defy recession and seem to crowd forward, trapping the figure at the surface of the image. Diagonals formed by moldings connect Ugolino's eyes to the David behind him, and background columns act like exclamation points over foreground books. These vigorous forms control the viewer's gaze across the surface of the image, exerting a constant pull between Ugolino, the written text behind him, beside him, and the statue beyond. The fictive space is severe and cold, with pale surfaces organized by a skin of dusty blue architectural details. This slightly grayish hue echoes the sapphire tone of the book covers, a color which appears more brilliantly in the deep blue silk peeking from slashes in Ugolino's black hose. Creamy skin set into shallow depth against varying tones of rich blue, deep blue black, and pale gray gives the painting a cameo-like appearance. Ugolino's form is fixed, yet still lithe and supple. The twisting of his figure, continued by his gaze, conveys movement while making any further motion impossible. Posed against the unmistakably Tuscan background, together with his books, Ugolino draws attention to a Florentine icon and asks the viewer to contemplate an ancient text. The civic connotations of the portrait are immediately evident. The architectural setting creates a strong sense of place. Its materials and forms an insistent reminder of Ugolino's Florentine identity. Equally explicit is the painted statue of David, which must, as Andreas Bayer writes, be understood here as a deliberate allusion to the iconography of the city of Florence. The partisan nature of these several Florentine references and their precise significance for Ugolino is less straightforward. Attempts to parse the painting's iconography have been distorted by information about Ugolino's connections and career and by the untidy history of Republican opposition in the early years of the Medici Duchy. A misreading of the Homeric text, with modern scholars unaware of its Renaissance usage, has further hampered efforts. These complications have made it difficult for today's viewers to see the statue of David in what must have been its intended mode, as the young biblical hero long symbolic of Florentine liberty, and, despite the painting's origin during the Medici Duchy, as an apotropaic talisman intended for the defenders of the anti-Medician Republic. The Martelli David is a 15th century statue today housed at the National Gallery in Washington. The young Israelite stands victorious over the severed head of his enemy, the spent sling hanging loosely at his side. With his weight balanced on one leg, the shepherd casts a casual foot across the giant's jaw. Bronzino's version is immediately recognizable if possessed of a vitality lacking in the original. During Ugolino's lifetime, this statue was believed to be the work of Donatello. Vasari describes it as the legacy of an affectionate relationship between the sculptor and one of Ugolino's 15th century ancestors. For 16th century viewers, this elevated lineage would connect the statue to Donatello's two more famous Davids, rendered in marble and bronze. These well-known images celebrated the small Florentine Republic's victories over its more powerful foes. Together with their inscriptions, they offered a warning to tyrants, both foreign and internal. The early Medici associated themselves with this anti-tyrannical rhetoric, but at the close of the 15th century, their enemies wielded it against them. In 1494, with the expulsion of the Medici, the new Republican leadership declared tyranny defunct, replaced with liberty and equality. In recognition of this shift, Donatello's bronze David was transferred from the Palazzo Medici to the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of the Republican government. The statue's anti-tyrannical content was thus endowed with a decidedly anti-Medician bent. It was with these earlier examples in mind that Michelangelo's David came into being. When the new Republican Constitution was adopted in 1501, Michelangelo was immediately commissioned to undertake the marble statue. Beginning in 1504, the shepherd stood guard outside the Palazzo della Signoria. Although questions remain as to the precise motives behind the original commission and placement of the statue, it is clear that once the David was set before the Signoria, its role as emblem of that entity was unequivocal. David was identified not just as the hero of Florence, but as the particular protector of the Florentine Republic. Niccolò Machiavelli, for example, when observing the importance of a citizen militia, invoked the young shepherd as the personification of the city's native troops. Likewise, in a portrait from circa 1510, Michelangelo's statue can be seen maintaining its vigil as an armed man half draws his sword in a demonstration of his similar willingness to defend the Republic. Vasari describes the statue as an exemplar, intended so that, in the same way that David had defended his people and governed them with justice, so those who governed Florence should defend it courageously and govern it justly. In the following decades, the explicitly anti-Medician connotations of Michelangelo's David were continually reinforced. Its partisan significance was shaped by its location, official treatment, and public response, echoing the history of Donatello's Davids in the previous century. Each time power changed hands, in 1512, again in 1527, and for the last time in 1530, Michelangelo's statue became embroiled in the ruling government's attempt to self-identify using public images. By the late 1520s, regardless of the sculptor's original intent, Michelangelo's David was seen as an avatar of the Republic, an icon revered by its supporters and attacked by its opponents. During the siege, as in other periods of Medicean threat, David was celebrated as a model for the Republic's youthful defenders. It was at this time, according to Vasari, that Pontormo painted his portrait of the Republican guardsman Francesco Guardi, the so-called Getty halberdier. In the portrait and its allegorical cover, Pontormo and Bronzino invoke the marble Davids of Donatello and Michelangelo. Again, as in the Republican portrait of 1510, the famous sculptures help convey the sitter's allegiance to the Republic and willingness to fight in its defense. Even though the last republic fell in 1530, it should not be assumed that this transfer of power would affect immediate and pervasive alterations in the meaning of republican icons. In 1537, when Bronzino included a Florentine David in his portrait of Ugolino Martelli, the figure's militant symbolism was certainly still intact. In fact, due to the increasing destabilization of the Florentine state and to frequent invocations of David by Republican dissidents, the young tyrant slayer was more divisive than ever. In the years between Bronzino's allegorical portrait of Dante and his portrait of Ugolino Martelli, the situation in Florence had deteriorated. In the mid to late 1530s, the city was experiencing the worst instability it had since the siege. Ducal authority derived from foreign powers was anything but secure. Meanwhile, Charles V, Francis I, and the Catholic popes all laid claim to Tuscan soil, creating tensions that were intensified by a Turkish threat from the east. At home, the Florentine people grew ever more restless under the unpopular Duke Alessandro. The contemporary historian Bernardo Segni reports that when the Medici Pope Clement VII died in 1534, delighted Florentines, quote, celebrated in their secret hearts the death of one of the principal authors of their city's most bitter tyranny. Segni explains that the Florentines blamed Clement because, rather than restoring the city to liberty, he had helped install, quote, an extremely cruel lord in the presence of a bastard prince. That is, Alessandro. Clement's successor, however, harbored goals that were decidedly anti-Medician. Pope Paul III welcomed the Florentine exiles, giving them hope for papal support in their campaigns against the Duke. In the middle of the decade, in 1535-6, the Florentine political situation was further destabilized by the failure of negotiations between the disgruntled leaders of the exiles and the Emperor Charles V, whose forces still held Florence in support of the Medici. The city was on the verge of economic collapse, the threat of violence growing, and then in January of 1537, Duke Alessandro was murdered by his cousin. During these volatile first years of the Medici Duchy, Republican references to David were especially plentiful, encouraged by the tyrannical reputation of the loathsome Duke Alessandro, who made a fitting Goliath. One writer bitterly pronounced him the most bloody and impious tyrant that nature ever produced on earth. An anonymous epigraph likewise condemned Alessandro as the most monstrous and shameful tyrant of Florence. Likewise, when Michelangelo left the city for good in 1534, he wrote an allegorical poem characterizing the contemporary Medici as cruel giants squashing their citizens under their feet. Contemporary political language also draws specific analogies between the hero David and the anti-Medician Republic of Florence, portraying the Republic as David and its enemies as Goliath. One example comes from the Republican leader Jacopo Nardi, who in 1535 went to Naples to plead the exiles' case with the Emperor Charles V. As a representative of the Republic, Nardi gave an oration in the form of an exposition on David's fifth psalm. The psalm is David's request for God's aid against his enemies, and Nardi presents the lines as an allegory of the Republicans' plea for the emperor's action against Duke Alessandro. In explanation of the verse, Nardi draws repeated parallels between David and the Florentine Republicans, and between David's enemies and the Medici Duke. He writes, "As David's enemy was bloodthirsty and cruel like a wolf, so is my adversary, says our city." Nardi repeatedly asserts that David and the Republic are one and the same. He asks Charles V to send aid to your servant David, that is, to your people. And later, "This, your majesty, your David, and your meek popolo fiorentino ask of you." When Republican entreaties to the Emperor Charles V to depose Alessandro were unsuccessful, the Republican exiles next called upon the French king Francis I to act as a second David, liberating Florence from the yoke of the Medici. When this too failed, it was Alessandro's assassin who took up the hero's mantle. The Duke's killer was celebrated not only as Brutus, as we've seen in Michelangelo's commemorative bust, but also as Florence's long-awaited David. In late January of 1537, following the murder, Jacopo Nardi wrote gleefully to the patron of Michelangelo's Brutus, the Cardinal Niccolò Ridolfi. Ridolfi, one of the most important advocates for a restoration of the Florentine Republic, was also Ugolino Martelli's relative and mentor. In Nardi's letter, written in celebration of Alessandro's assassin, the writer proclaims that divine providence has now seen fit to strike down the insolence of the haughty giant, and hath raised up a horn of salvation for us in the hand of his servant David, provided for us in this valiant young man. The italics are in the original, indicating where Nardi is quoting from the Gospel of Luke. Significantly, he has altered the Latin from in domo to in manu. That is, the salvation of Florence is now in David's hand rather than his house, as in the biblical text. This change underscores the action, the firing of David's sling, involved in committing the tyrannicide necessary to overthrow the Medici Duchy. Still, Some scholars have concluded that in the Ugolino Martelli, the figure of David has lost its former civic meaning. More surprising is a recent analysis which proposes that the statue of David has not only lost its Republican connotation, but its meaning has been realigned to become an endorsement of Medici rule. Yet while Duke Cosimo certainly reappropriated some Republican symbols, this does not apply to images of the young David in the 1530s. There are no undisputed occasions of Davidian iconography used by the Medici in the first decade of the duchy, perhaps not even until the late 1540s. The anti-tyrannical rhetoric that flourished on the occasion of Alessandro's murder was still too polemical and too closely associated with the Republican opposition. Bronzino's portrait of Ugolino Martelli likely dates to the autumn following Alessandro's murder, a period in which advocates for the restoration of the Republic were highly optimistic. For most of 1537, Florence was without a living monarch. Alessandro had been killed in early January, and Cosimo was not officially made duke until late September, nearly 10 months later. In August, Cosimo's spy in Venice reported that the Republican exiles went about, quote, saying that everyone in Florence is malcontented and the government is in confusion. These exiles being of the opinion that you are weak, and that by conspiring with your enemies, they will easily be able to enter the city in victory. On July 15th, Donato Gianotti equated Florence with, quote, a ripe pear, ready to drop at any moment with the slightest encouragement, and so we wait with great desire, like Jews for the Messiah, for forces to arrive in Tuscany and overthrow the government. This government cannot last. 2 weeks later, the Republican rebels took action. Furushiti troops rallied under the leadership of the exiled banker Filippo Strozzi and a trio of wealthy Florentine cardinals, including Ugolino's relation and mentor, Niccolo Ridolfi. But the Republicans miscalculated their advantage. During the nighttime hours of July 31st and August 1st, 1537, the exiles were routed at the Battle of Montemurlo. Bronzino's portrait of Ugolino Martelli, datable to shortly thereafter, should be understood in the context of this Republican defeat. Ugolino's portrait responds to contemporary Florentine and political issues with remarkable specificity and precision of meaning, despite a lack of obvious allusions to recent events. The effect is reliant on a purposeful collapse of time, rendering the ancient world as urgent and immediate as contemporary life. This approach to the past was advocated by Ugolino's tutor and Bronzino's friend, Benedetto Varchi. Varchi stressed the modern relevance and applicability of classical writers, urging his followers to see Homer, quote, like a mirror in which are reflected all of the paths by which one may escape vice and achieve virtue. In Bronzino's portrait, Ugolino Martelli gestures to the volume of Homer set before him. The title and first 14 lines of Book 9 of the Iliad lie open on the table. After years of battle, Agamemnon and his troops are camped outside the walls of Troy. Facing failure, Agamemnon summons his men, intending to concede defeat. Ugolino, with his finger, directs us to the final line in which Agamemnon rises to speak. What follows would be Agamemnon's proposal to his weary soldiers that they abandon the siege of Troy and return defeated home. The suggestion prompts disobedience from the men as they proclaim their determination to remain and fight, resolving to stay until the battle is won. Interpreters of Bronzino's Ugolino Martelli have relied upon a literal reading of the Homeric text, an understanding that conflicts with the Renaissance understanding of the Trojan scene. Though the passage in fact delineates lament and resignation, it would have been understood by Bronzino's contemporaries to inspire the opposite. The poet Ludovico Castelvetro, in an argument leveled against Varchi, cites this same incident from Homer to characterize a rhetorical tactic. Castelvetro writes that it's hard to tell whether Varchi is in earnest or, quote, is following the artifice which served Homer in the speech of Agamemnon, in which he urges the Greeks to leave the siege of Troy, and, in defending the opinion, provides all the reasons that prove the contrary. In the portrait, the use of ancient Greek implies an audience of Ugolino's intellectual circle, for whom the Trojan scene evidently held particular significance. In 1539, Varchi sent a letter to Bronzino requesting that he read over a translation of the parallel portion of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which Varchi had completed sometime earlier. The section is from Book 13 and contains the orations by Ajax and Ulysses on the arms of Achilles. Ulysses recounts his reaction when Agamemnon declares his intent to abandon the war. "What are you doing?" I yelled. "This is madness, abandoning Troy, which is already seized. What are you taking home after 10 years here, except disgrace?" My words turned them around and brought them back. Agamemnon assembled all the troops. I stood up and urged my trembling comrades to take on the enemy, and my words restored their faltering courage. Instead of signaling resignation and defeat, in Bronzino's Ugolino Martelli, the text from the Iliad represents a timely expression of support for the Republican cause. After the setback at Montemurlo, the Homeric exhortation to stay until the battle is won, in spite of delays, disappointments, and forlorn prospects, must have held great resonance for Republicans like Ugolino. The pairing of the Iliad with the Martelli David encourages a dynamic reading of the lessons from the past. What is more, in the case of Bronzino's Ugolino Martelli, the Homeric scene functions as a doubly convenient artistic allegory. Due to the contemporary association of the Habsburg emperors with the Trojan lords, the passage accommodates precise political factionalism. It was, after all, the Habsburg Emperor Charles V who had created the Medici Duchy and whose forces maintained it against the Republican exiles. And in the early and mid-16th century, the Habsburgs employed Trojan iconography to justify imperial, and by extension provincial, claims to sovereignty. Trojan references appear in erudite treatises and Habsburg dynastic histories and in artistic and literary representations. The Medici dukes, as imperial vassals, inherited this well-developed iconography. The fit was natural. The Medici had already associated their rule with the Aeneas legend since the early 15th century, as Janet Cox-Reich has shown. Moreover, the analogy between Troy and imperial Florence was not only employed in the service of ducal aims, but was also wielded by the enemies of the Medici. In an anti-Medician poem that circulated during the siege, imperial Florence is referred to as questa ingorda Troia, this greedy Troy. Of course, an alternative translation of this double entendre would be this greedy whore. In Ugolino's portrait, the lines from the Iliad should be understood as a rejection of the imperial Medician domination of Florence. This reading is entirely appropriate to Ugolino's biography. He spent much of his adult life in exile, working among the most important figures in the Florentine anti-Medician community, even developing a lasting friendship with the brother of Duke Alessandro's assassin. For Ugolino's friends who remained in Florence, these connections were damning. Those who valued their ducal patrons were forced to sever contact, as was the case with Luca Martini, whose acid letter mentioned earlier recommends that Ugolino be punished and chastised. Ugolino's contemporaries had no doubts as to the subversive nature of his beliefs. The young man's portrait, however, seems designed, at least in part, to deceive. Its Republican significance is available only to those viewers able to read Homer in the ancient Greek and to understand the subtle import of the selected passage. And while this statue carries a more transparent political connotation, the presence of the Martelli David in Ugolino's portrait can easily be justified in neutral terms as honoring a family heirloom. Ugolino's portrait frames its descent in seemingly innocuous terms of literature, history, and art. So what appears to be a straightforward statement of literary aptitude and Florentine patriotism is equally open to a reading as a gesture of Republican allegiance, but only by those possessed of the necessary erudition. It is a highly subversive picture, but one that speaks its opposition in the language of the past. On March 29, 1539, Cosimo I dei Medici and Eleonora di Toledo were married by proxy in Naples. The new Duchess arrived in Florence on the 29th of June, occasioning lavish celebrations that lasted throughout the month of July. The festivities marked the city's first real progress towards cultural recovery following the fall of the last republic nearly 10 years earlier. They also provided Bronzino's introduction to his most famous patrons. On July 6, 1539, a wedding banquet was held in the Palazzo Medici, and several artists, including Bronzino, contributed decorations for the event. The courtyard was lined with scenes depicting significant moments in the family's history, and, according to Vasari, those painted by Bronzino surpassed all the others. They caught the attention of the Duke, who offered Bronzino his first commission as court painter, a role he would occupy for the next 25 years. In this evening's lecture, I've argued that before the start of Bronzino's tenure as court painter, he produced paintings expressive of equivocal sentiment towards the new ducal establishment. But if the artist personally harbored anti-Medician inclinations, or if, in 1539, Cosimo had any misgivings about Bronzino's loyalties, there is no record of reluctance on either side in beginning this new relationship. In fact, in the first years of the duchy, it was not uncommon for artists to move easily between Republican and Medician patrons. Many Florentine artists seem to have welcomed commissions without reference to a potential patron's political ideology, while Cosimo and Alessandro actually sought out artists known to have provided works for their enemies. The dukes were eager to secure the city's best artists. Excluding those who had served their Republican opponents would have deprived the new rulers of Florence's premier talent. Moreover, it seems likely that the decision to employ artists previously engaged in Republican projects may have been a tactical choice on the part of the dukes, who hoped to present themselves as a continuation of, rather than a break from, the city's Republican history. In the 1530s, the duke's most powerful opponents were members of the city's traditional oligarchic aristocracy, a privileged class who saw Cosimo and Alessandro as undeserving outsiders. So in their campaigns to win Florentine support, the dukes sought not to distinguish themselves from their opponents, but rather to reassure them of their equality and as peers and representatives of the Florentine elite. During the tumultuous decade that began with the siege of Florence, Bronzino created both Republican and Medician images. The notorious difficulty faced by modern scholars in interpreting his portraits from the period may be to some extent explained by the fact that whereas the dukes hoped to win supporters by aligning themselves visually with their opponents, the Republicans necessarily camouflaged their dissent in imagery acceptable to the Medici establishment. Bronzino's Medician pictures from his tenure as court painter have been cited as evidence of the artist's that the artist's loyalty to the dukes is absolute, precluding the possibility of his having painted any Republican images in the 1530s. Such generalizations impose too rigid a formula on a period of deep political uncertainty. Bronzino's portraits from the 1530s provide an example of art made in the context of uncertain change. Unlike his works of the 1540s and beyond, Bronzino's paintings of the 1530s belong to a reality in which a future of Florentine hegemony was by no means guaranteed, and in which Republican culture thrived in defiant, if sometimes furtive, manifestations. Thank you.